This is how to crochet the camel stitch hat row 7. I already took out my stitch marker, added my first half double crochet. Now I'm going to put my stitch marker back, add my second half double crochet into the same stitch, and then I'm going to put one regular half double crochet into each of the next 5 stitches. Then I'm going to repeat that all the way around. Now while we're working on this row, I did want to talk about gauge. So one way to tell if a pattern is well written is to look at the gauge swatch. A designer that knows about gauge swatches, to me, is a good designer. Now in some projects it's less important, but if you're making a garment and you get a pattern for a sweater, a hat, gloves, a scarf, scarves are debatable too. But something that has to be worn and has to fit a certain size, a gauge swatch is very important, because it helps you make sure that your project ends up being the size of the designer's project and therefore fits the person you're trying to make it for. Normally, a gauge swatch is given in the form of how many stitches and how many rows it took the designer to create a 4-inch square using a certain stitch. Now, since this hat is worked in the round, designers will often account for that by telling you how many rows it took them to get to a 4-inch circle. So if you got to the recommended number of rows and your circle ends up being larger than 4 inches, you would have to start over with a smaller hook to make your stitches smaller. If your circle ends up being smaller than 4 inches, you would have to start over with a larger hook to make your circle larger. Now for this hat in particular, we're going over the basics of how to make a hat. Therefore, the size of the hook, the size of the yarn, and the gauge doesn't matter. And that is because we are going to increase the circle regardless of how many rows we have, because we're looking to get to the recommended diameter for the size of hat that we're looking for. And that ties into my last video. Essentially, my goal is to show you how to make a hat using any hook, any yarn, any stitch really, so that you don't have to follow a specific pattern unless you like this specific design. But row 8 is going to be in the comments.